Hi, I'm Jeff Senni. Welcome to Season 2 of Making Waves on Purpose. Today we are going to turn the tables and I'm handing the mic over to my friend and coach, Jennifer Davis. Jennifer is the founder of the Jennifer Davis Media Group. She's a strategic communications consultant and content provider who works with leaders and organizations to help them find and tell their stories. And she's been a great help to me, both when I was at PwC and now that I'm out on my own with Sandbar Solutions. And we're going to have a conversation about Season 1, what we learned, Season 2, where we're going. So Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'm a former reporter too for 15 years. So I get to tap into my old skills and ask you some hard questions. So let's do it. Okay, well, first of all, congratulations on a successful first season. And here's to Season 2. Let's talk about what you've learned along the way. And let's start at the very beginning. Why did you start the podcast in the first place?
I think there's a conversation in the ESG, corporate responsibility, corporate citizenship, D&I, you name it, name the acronym space. That needs to be happening. And I have such a good network of amazing people to talk to that I wanted to be part of that conversation and help lead it in maybe in some ways that it wouldn't be. A little less kind of corporate buttoned up and a little bit more real about what people are experiencing, both the kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of change.
Yeah, I think you and I talk a lot in the space around ESG and purpose that it's very aspirational, but there's less talk about the realities of it. What's hard, the resistance, the disagreements. And if you don't talk about that stuff, then you're never actually going to drive the change that you want, right? People are a little too shiny in how they focus on it sometimes.
I think that's right. And a lot of my thinking has changed over the years on this. But one of the things that really inspired me, Jason Jay and Gabe Grant wrote a book about pitfalls in the space and how actually the change agents are part of the problem when it doesn't resonate. Because we have a tendency to say if somebody doesn't agree with us, it's because they're morally corrupt or bankrupt or they just don't get it or that they're somehow flawed. And it's not our approach that could be flawed. It's them, which doesn't help advance our cause.
Not really. Yeah, I work with a lot of people in the ESG space. And what I find is everyone is so passionate and you believe in these concepts around purpose and DEI and all of these other things so deeply. And so when other people don't disagree, it's hard, I think, for people sometimes to figure out how to communicate in that space. And I think there's also sometimes an assumption among those working in the space that these concepts are so important and right and true that it's a difficult conversation when you get pushback. And so I think talking about how you talk about it is really important. And that seems to me to be something you really did in this first season was you're not just talking about the ideas, you're really getting down into how are you doing it. And the name reflects that, right? The making waves part of this was very intentional when you titled the podcast, yes?
That's right. I mean, I think change makers make waves. And I think that's a saying that usually denotes some negative connotation, like don't make waves. But I think that's exactly what we're doing. We're making waves deliberately and we're trying to drive change and that has to be thoughtful. And sometimes those waves crash perfectly and we surf to the shore and sometimes they land on our head. And they might be the very waves that we created land on us. So I think we've got to look at the kind of process of change when it works and when it doesn't and what we can do better because I think your point is spot on. When I think about climate change, oftentimes the people I talk to, they're thinking about their sons and daughters' future or their granddaughters and grandsons. And what could be more important than that? I get that. And that drives people. But it also can drive us to be a little crazed about it.
Well, and it can drive you apart, right?
That's
like
right.
You don't have to agree with somebody to see their point of view. And I think that's what I hear you talking about all the time is that you dig into those conversations very directly and you see both sides. And I think sometimes people feel so principled that even acknowledging the other side starts to feel uncomfortable. But if you don't do that and meet people where they are and have real conversations about the differences, then you're never going to find that middle ground. And I mean, that's a big part of what you talk about with people, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, and I think I over time get more comfortable with that too, because that's scary. What we're talking about oftentimes is tensions within our values. So I had a great conversation with Bree Fram, Lieutenant Colonel from the U.S. Space Force, one of the highest ranking trans leaders within the U.S. military. Fascinating conversation. And when I talked to her, I said, listen, I don't want to engage the white nationalist or the ultra transphobe. Like, I'm not interested in that conversation. But I am interested in the 47-year-old soccer mom in West Texas who somehow sees LGBTQ as a threat to her family values or the republic or what have you. And I want to understand that mindset. I don't want to be complicit in it. I don't want to give it fuel that it doesn't deserve. But I do think that this person likely is a product of their environment, just as I am mine. I think more and more as I think about identities and do research on identities and mindset and purpose and values, we inherit a big portion of that from our parents, from where we grew up, from our experiences. And then now we live in these echo chambers of social media where we're told what to think. We're watching the news. We're not actually watching news. We're watching opinion. Yeah. And we're just being served up opinion after opinion. And a lot of people are just swallowing it. And it's hard not to. And so I want to understand like how we can break out of that, how we can reach across and understand. I'm reminded consistently of John McCain and his stopping the woman at the focus group who accused Barack Obama of being Islamic terrorist or something like that. And he stopped her and said, no, ma'am, I disagree with this man on a whole raft of issues, but he is an American and a good man, and I respect him and consider him a patriot. I think that is America, or should be. And I think we have lost that along the way. And that is showing up in fear within companies, the Anheuser-Busch, Bud Light, or Disney. Now companies feel like even more so that they can't take a position. I'm reminded of a saying that I heard years ago, which is companies for a long time just wanted to sit on the fence. And somebody told me sitting on the fence just gives you splinters in your ass.
Well, on the making waves part, though, what you're saying, basically, what I'm hearing is that all of these topics that you're talking about are arguably the most personal things happening in the working world. Everything else we're doing in the working world is business, right? Whatever your industry is, whatever your work is, you're doing the work. But all of this falls into something, as you say, it's values, it's deeply personal. It goes back to feelings that you have held since you were a child. And suddenly we're bringing all of that into the workplace and nobody knows how to talk about it. And so I love that you are talking about it. The other thing that I love about the title is that there is a really personal part of it for you too. Those who know you know that you talk about fear a lot as an industry topic, but you talk about the need to face things that are hard and difficult and uncomfortable personally too. And you do it routinely in bigger ways than a lot of us and on purpose. Talk about the personal connection for you with that title and how you're doing that in your own life.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I remember when I was at PwC, this would have been 10 years ago, I was at a dinner and I was talking to people about how I love kite surfing. And I was just getting into solo offshore kite surfing, where I might be 3 miles offshore, going across a bay. And I simultaneously love going with a group and doing it by myself. When I'm by myself, I want to be with a group. And when I'm with a group, I want to be by myself. I'm sure there's a call for a psychologist in there somewhere. But I really like these positions of where you put yourself in a fearful position because they just weed out the superfluous, the things that we just kind of carry with us, the baggage and this and that. And you are 100% focused on what you're doing. And I think if you can do that, and this is kind of like flow state that a lot of people talk about. You can find that in taking a walk. You can find that through meditation. You can find that through physical activity and yoga. And there's any number of ways you can find that. I find that the addition of fear really unlocks a different level of that for me. And I've also had a really nonlinear career. I've also done that in my career. 3 times I've left jobs that people just don't leave. You just don't leave these jobs. Once when I was in the hospitality business, I was general manager of a hotel, restaurant, conference center in Aspen, Colorado, which was a wonderful lifestyle. And I loved it. But I felt like I was living on an island and there was more to the world that I wanted to experience. And then I was at the UN and worked there for 4 years and loved it. And I went off to the African Development Bank to see what development looked like outside of the UN in New York and in a much different environment. And then I was at PwC for 11 years, which is, again, an amazing job with an amazing firm. But it only gives you one piece of the pie. And I wanted to see more and I wanted to expand my experience. That experience since hasn't been perfect. Those changes are not without some amount of regret, of course. You're giving up something. But I always find on the other side of that, there's so much benefit.
Those are my favorite discussions about purpose and fear. My work has always been driven by stories. As a former reporter, I told them for years. Now I do it in a corporate setting. And I think there's a tendency in the corporate world to think that stories need to be sort of, like I said, shiny and slick, like a press release, right? And telling you all the good stuff. But the great stories are the stories about when the waves crash on your head and when you face fear and you fail and when things don't, like, I love hearing leaders who are comfortable sharing that. And I think in the space of ESG and purpose, you have to be, well, you don't have to be, but I think you are most successful when you are able to lean into when it's not working, because that's where the connection comes from. And that's where the growth and the learning comes from. And, that's where the interesting stuff is. That's what drives change.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, two of the people that I'm really interested in reading about right now are Steve Jobs, not because of where he ended up. He was fired by Apple and came back. What that must have been like to be fired by the company that you created and then being invited back and have learned all these lessons in the interim and bring it from where it was to where it ended up when he passed away. Or Jeff Immelt. I'm fascinated by Jeff Immelt because when I was coming up to this space 20 years ago, he was the guy. And he would come out and he would talk about all of the things that were happening in corporate responsibility. This was Eco Imagination at GE. And GE was an early pioneer, at least in the branding part of a lot of this. And then he flamed out. I'm fascinated by that.
Me too. And I think if we want to talk about trying to do things differently, you have to look at stories like that and figure out what the lesson is. When you talk about purpose, and you're talking about it on the podcast a lot, are you talking individual purpose, corporate purpose, all of it together? Is one more important than another? What matters to you?
Yes.
All of it.
Because I really think one of the things that we do and I call it changing the role of business in society because the acronym SOUP has just become so muddied. But whatever you call it, ESG or CR or what have you, I think we have to look at it through a wider context because individuals at many levels are going through a process of a new age is upon us that is creating some kind of alienation, some kind of angst that people are dealing with in their personal lives. Because I don't think the difficulty of having these conversations is just in business. It's at the Thanksgiving dinner table.
Sure.
My father was an adamant Trump supporter. And the day that Trump was elected, I called him up. And I said, your guy won. And he said, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I see the desire for a change. I understand that. I don't think we had to elect a guy who had such character defects as Trump. And my dad about jumped through the phone and throttled me. Like he could not have a dispassionate conversation about this guy. He could not have and I wasn't trying to push his buttons. I was just trying to say, like, I get why we want this change. I'm not sure that's the right path. And I think that's part of the problem. So we've got to look at, though, individual purpose and what individuals are going through, government, which is in a lot of ways having similar problems to companies in that they're trying to reinvent themselves. You've got business and you've got civil society. We've got to look at that all together and mash it up because if we just work on one piece, the machinery won't work. The system won't work. And what we are trying to do is create a new system. We're trying to create a multiracial democracy in a country that essentially was based on white nationalism. And that's not me being anti-American. That's just looking at the founding fathers and the reality in which they grew up, in which they founded this country. And we are still living with a lot of the echoes and the shadow that casts across America. And we're trying to get past that. And I think, great, we elected a Black president. I don't think that means we're post-racial. And I'd say there's good evidence that we're not. And so I think it's all about our democracy and our republic. It's also about capitalism, which has brought many billions of people out of poverty and yet has created amazing inequality and really depleted the world's natural resources in very troubling ways. So we've got to look at this, I think, through a wider lens. It's not just climate change. It's not just inequality. It is about the very essence of the world that we want to create, that we will live in into the future for ourselves and our children and their children.
As a communication strategist, I'm struck by the fact that these are not subjects that many people are neutral on, to your point, right? People feel very strongly one way or another about this. And I think they don't know how to talk through the differences. That's a big deal when you're trying to influence hearts and minds and drive an organization in a certain direction. After your first season, what have you learned from people about how they're doing it? Or do you think that just continues to remain a giant struggle that people still haven't completely figured out?
I think it's the latter. I think it's a giant struggle that we're all trying to figure out, because at the end of the day, you have to be in the system. Well, it's not true that you have to be in the system to change the system, but the entire concept of a corporate sustainability officer is to be within the system to change it. There are other ways. Civil society and nonprofits and academics and government can have levers to change business as well. But the side that I came up on is distinctly pro-business, and I am distinctly pro-business. And so you are within the company trying to change it for the betterment of itself and its stakeholders. And that is business strategy. That is not morality. That is not pie. It is not a form of purpose that leverages words like karma. And I think part of this is how we present it. I don't think of this as a spiritual retreat in the Himalayas, where we're sitting around cross-legged. I think of this as, okay, what is the context in which these businesses work? And business has long had to adjust itself to its economic, environmental, social realities. Those realities are just so stark and so challenging right now that I think it would be much easier if we didn't have to, but we just don't have a choice.
Well, I think this is an interesting point in time, because during the pandemic, it looked like a lot of companies were very quickly adapting and changing their approach and their philosophies about a lot of things around purpose and all of these concepts that you talk about. And then now, a couple of years later, very little of it seems to have stuck. Most companies seem to be boomeranging back to their 2019 ways and older habits and beliefs. If you're someone who's interested in change making and you look at what's happening, why is it happening? And is this a good or a bad thing? Is it good that we at least tried to move the needle in one direction? Or is it frustrating and a bad sign that change is just very, very difficult?
I think it's really interesting. So I just completed a project working with CECP and the Gates Foundation on looking at lessons learned from COVID and how we can apply them to future pandemics or crises of all sorts. One of the primary findings is around this idea of shared resilience. And that shared resilience is built on a number of things, one of them being empathy. And there was a Fortune survey that came out not so long ago that said, when asked, majority of leaders were asked what had changed during COVID about their leadership style, and the majority answered empathy. And I was talking to another person in the space who's very well known, and he said, I saw that too. It's fascinating. I wonder if it's true. And it really stopped me in my tracks, because I oh, wow, I think I bought it. And without being really hypercritical of it. And I'm not sure it has actually changed. I think there are good indications that companies are being more in tune with their stakeholders' needs, and they're trying to develop and flex those muscles. But there are also countervailing currents. I saw yesterday on my LinkedIn, and I posted it, there's a billionaire in Australia that on tape comes out in an interview and says, I just think employees are too whiny. We need higher unemployment to teach them the value of work and how good they have it. What are you talking? Did you really say that? And it's just fascinating. So I do think there is clearly still, and I don't know how you want to describe that, but there is still a countervailing current against much of this that still believes that any of this stuff is beyond the pale of business and that the business of business is business. The Milton Friedman famous quote has not lost all of its purchase, that's for sure.
So let's talk about season 2 and where you're headed. And for those people who are listening because they want to hear from change makers who have not lost their optimism and are still finding ways to drive change in their sphere, what do you think are some of the things that folks need to do? You know, one of the concepts that I talk about a lot in the leadership coaching that I do with CEOs and executives is assuming best intent. And it always strikes me that it's just a concept that is sorely lacking in the business world, and particularly in this space, I think, because everyone has their own perspectives and point of views. So when people disagree, right, it feels very personal and you immediately go to this place of how strong it is. But to your point, if you can assume best intent and just have some empathy, realize there's a lot of factors likely in play here, it does change the conversation. And I know you're going to be talking about optimism, you're going to be talking about empathy. What other concepts are you really going to be digging into in your season 2 interviews?
I think you hit it on the head, this idea of acceptance. Like, I think most people, and perhaps I'm naive, I think most people truly do care about other people. They might care about people who are closer to them in their thinking and their way of living than others. I think that's quite natural. But we've got to be able to see, like, I think most CEOs want to do the right thing. I think they are overwhelmed. I think they are fear of, I worked 38 years to get to this seat and I'm not going to mess it up by going on some expedition to deal with God knows what issue. Like I was trained for 38 years to focus on profit through a certain lens and a certain way of doing that. And now you're telling me to throw that lens and all that experience out. Like, that seems crazy to me. I agree. That would be crazy. It's about adding a series of lenses, not taking away necessarily. I think there still is a very strong and should be a very strong profit motive for business because that drives so many benefits for so much of the world, but that we have to look at it through a wider lens and we have to accept people. And now there are times we shouldn't. There are clearly, it's now back in the news that Exxon was publicly saying climate change and internally denying it. Like, that's bad faith. And we need to call that out. And I think right now, one of the things companies really need to work on, especially global companies, is this idea of cultural relativism. I'm married to a Brazilian. I live in Argentina. I've lived around the world. I live cultural relativism every day. The idea that if the Saudis ask you only to send women on your work with them, that's not cultural relativism. That is breaking with the rights and norms that we have decided as a globe through the United Nations and other institutions that we should uphold. And I think we should not put profit above the rights of women, and period. Like, it's that simple. And your values are only your values when they're difficult to apply. Otherwise, it's just a bumper sticker. Here's my values. And and it's the same thing for purpose. I think purpose, far too many companies have kind of gone to as a bumper sticker rather than a boardroom issue. And we need to change that.
So I know you're going to talk about some of those rosier topics of optimism, empathy, purpose, but you have to dig into the fear too, because you keep bringing it up, right? Whether the leaders are worried about losing or maintaining their position or going viral or making headlines for bad things. There's a lot of fear that's driving things in big and little ways. Who are some of the first guests you're going to have coming up here this season? And in what way do you want to dig into managing fear this season?
Well, I've got Andrew Winston, an amazing guy I've known for years. He and I had a conversation recently. Greg Unruh, who is a professor in this space. And I've got a number of others who are on deck. I think each conversation kind of has a feel of its own and kind of goes where it goes. And I think it is uncomfortable for change leaders as well as people in business. But it is about finding this. When we say more and more about bringing humanity into business or bringing our full selves into business, I don't think that's entirely true. I don't know that anybody wants my full self. But I do think that We cannot call ourselves diverse and inclusive if we cannot accept different political beliefs within our discussions at the individual or collective level and understand what's driving those. And that's true Republican, Democrat in the United States. That's true communist and capitalist and democracy globally. We are driving apart on so many levels, nationally and internationally. I don't think that's the direction we need to be going in order to solve the problems that we're facing. And so part of this just has to be, how do we accept the person without accepting the beliefs? And I love what you said up front with this idea, you don't have to agree with someone to listen to someone.
Yeah. But that is my focus. I just love the idea that you're digging into these concepts, having conversations, and that it's messy and there's not always a clear solution or answer. And I think that's a big takeaway too, is defining what success is. You have your long-term markers of success and you should keep working towards those. But I think what we hear in the conversations you have is that sometimes the short-term markers of success are just people being able to talk about it. It's not necessarily hitting a mark that you're trying to hit. It may be falling short, but sometimes just having the conversations and getting the people in the room and talking about these things, that feels like a micro success, but you got to start somewhere. And that's not a terrible place to start, right?
I think that's right. And I think, ultimately we have to face the situation we're in kind of wide-eyed and honestly and openly, but we also have to keep our optimism. I'm reminded of Barack Obama's quote, this idea that, the moral arc of history bends towards justice, but only if we work at it. And I think that we just need to do the work.
Well, here's to riding waves in season 2. It was good to talk to you. Thanks for letting me relive my journalism days.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Looking forward to season 2. Thanks for listening to Making Waves on Purpose. If you like what you heard, please hit subscribe. Thank you.